words, and I think you're all very special young people. And what is the first word we say every morning? Anyone know? Modeh. So the very first word we give is lahodot, zot hapa modeh Hashem. To be a Jew is to thank God every single day. So I thank God that He has created such lovely children as you and such great schools as these. Tell me, let's have a cheer. Who is here from Torah Academy? Who is here from the Hillel Day School? Well, you're both great, and please thank Hashem that He brought you to these lovely schools on such a beautiful place on such a lovely day. Children, I don't really know what to say to you. I'm going to make space for you to ask questions. But I want you just to think about one thing. You know, you're going to grow up and you're going to leave school and you're going to go out into the world. And you're going to ask yourself a very simple question. How can I make a difference to the world? How can I make the world that is a little closer to the world that ought to be? There are 7 billion people on the face of this planet, and each of us is only one. How can one affect the world? If you think about our significance in the scheme of things, it's easy to think that each of us is only a wave in the ocean, or a grain of sand on the seashore, or a little piece of dust on the surface of eternity. How can we make a difference? And along came Chazal, our sages, and they said something really extraordinary. And the Rambam brings it, La'alocha, in chapter 3 of Hilchot Teshuvah. And they say this: each one of us is judged by the majority of our deeds. So if the majority of our deeds are good, we get blessed for good. And if they're not good things happen to us. And so it is for a town, and so it is for a country, and so it is for the world. And therefore, says the Rambam, every one of us, every day, should see ourselves as if our life were evenly poised. 50% good deeds and 50% not good deeds. And so for the universe. And our next deed might change the fate of our life and the fate of the universe. So here we have 2 extremely different ways of thinking about a life. On the one hand, we can't make a difference. Judaism insists we can. Our next deed might change the universe. I want to tell you a little story, because just a couple of weeks ago we were in Washington in a shul where a certain lady once lived, and I'm going to tell you the story. There was an African American called Stephen Carter. And there was a time when Washington, D.C. was a very racially segregated city. There were areas that were only white areas. And Stephen Carter, who was a young African American, went in the early 1960s with his parents and his brothers and sisters to become the first black family in an area in Washington where they'd never had a black family before. And many years later, he was writing the story of this move. And he said, my brothers and sisters and I went out the next morning after our move to the front of the house to see how people would welcome us to the area. And he wrote, they didn't. They didn't say a word to us. They didn't even look at us. And at that moment, I knew that we would never belong here. There's no place for us here. They won't accept us here. We should never have come. He said at that moment, my eye was caught by a lady across the road who was walking down the street, her arms laden with shopping, and she gave us all a big smile. And then she went into her house across the road and came out with a big tray laden with cookies and drinks. And she came over to my brothers and sisters and myself, with a huge smile and brought us the cakes and the drinks and said, "Welcome to the neighborhood. It's so good to have you here." He said that day changed my life. It taught me that as an African American, I did have a place. He said that lady who sadly died very young was called Sarah Kestenbaum. He said it probably wasn't an accident that she was a religious Jew, because Jews have a word for this kind of thing. They call it chesed, which means kindness, especially to strangers, especially when it's hard. So that day changed my life and made me realize I did have a place in America. Stephen Carter went on to become professor of law at Yale University. And I told this story once in a shul in Washington. And after I told this story, people came up to me and said, "You know, Sarah Kestenbaum was a member of our shul. We never heard that story before." But yes, that's the kind of thing she used to do. And I suddenly thought, could she have known that day when she brought out a tray of cookies and smiled at this black family, could she have known that that was going to change their lives? Well, of course she couldn't have known. And she never lived to read the story. But I suddenly realized what our sages meant, what Chazal meant, what Rambam meant. Because if it is true, as they say, as the Mishnah in Sanhedrin chapter 4 says, that nefesh achat k'olam malei, one life is like a universe, then if you change one life, you begin to change the universe. And that is something each of us can do by sometimes a single act of chesed to somebody who needs kindness at that moment, somebody who's feeling frightened or alone or depressed or miserable. And just by being friends with them and giving them strength, that can change your life. And it's the way you change the world, the only way you can, one life at a time, one day at a time. I'm going to tell you a little story because I don't know, the last time we were here in Florida, it was a long time ago, and I'm going to tell you the story of a lady I once met. And the reason I'm telling you this story is because she had a holiday home here not very far from here, in Palm Beach, that's not too far away. And she, very sadly, she was horse riding in a place called Wellington. Is that near here? Reasonably near. She had an accident, very sadly, and she died at the beginning of this year, right at the end of January of this year, not that far from here. And I want to tell you her story. I met her a couple of times. And I thought when I'm here in Florida, which was where she lived several months a year, I would tell her story. She was a lady called Anne Heyman. Heyman. She was an ordinary Jewish woman with children who was living in Manhattan at the time when she watched a television program. Have you been following Bob Geldof and what's it called? The Ebola? Forget it, don't worry about it. Anyway, she was in 2004 watching a television program about Rwanda. Does anyone know what happened in Rwanda 20 years ago? Anyone know? What happened? No, it wasn't a helicopter crash, no. Anyone know? Yeah? Yeah, exactly. What happened in Rwanda in 1994, 20 years ago, was that there was a kind of civil war between two tribes. One of them were called the Hutus, and the other were called the Tutsis. And the Hutus attacked the Tutsis and killed 800,000 people in 100 days. It was one of the worst catastrophes since the Holocaust. And Anne Heyman was watching a television program, 10 years on, at what had happened to all the orphans from Rwanda. And it was a really, really tragic film, because when 800,000 people are killed, that means there are an awful lot of orphans left. And she was sitting 10 years ago watching the television, and she said to herself, hang on, I'm Jewish. We're supposed to do something when we see things like that, when we see children suffering, when we see genocide like happened in Rwanda, when we see orphans, we do something. Now, what can one single person do to change that for all those young people? Well, she thought. And she sat down and she said, well, look, there were a lot of orphans left after the Shoah, after the Holocaust. And a lot of them went to Israel. And in Israel, I have people who are specialists in looking after children who suffered trauma. What's more, in Israel, there's a little village called Yamin Ord, which was built for orphans. Originally orphans from the Holocaust, then orphans from Ethiopia. And there's somebody called Chaim Perry who built that youth village. And there's a great professor called Professor Reuben Feuerstein, sadly no longer alive, who deals with. So she phoned up Chaim Perry, Reuben Feuerstein, all the youth villages in Israel, and she started phoning up her friends and saying, we've got to do something for these Rwandan villages. And what she did was, she built a youth village in Rwanda for 750 orphans from the Rwandan genocide. It is one of the most beautiful things you'll ever see, an Israeli youth village in the middle of Africa. And this village is where all those 750 young orphans lived, and they taught them how to grow avocados, how to use computers, how to become successful, how to become leaders. And the only thing they asked in return is that when they grew up, they would teach some of these skills to other Rwandan children. This village, do any of you use YouTube? Oh, wow. Okay, guys. When you get a chance, look up YouTube, look up the following. Agahozo, right? Aghahozo, Shalom Youth Village. And then you will see a little video about how this little village gave new hope to 750 children who had no one, whose parents had been killed, who had been traumatized. And this one lady built this little village to change 750 lives with the one condition that they would go out when they grew up and help others change their lives as well. And this lady who lived in not far from here was somebody I so admired because she changed many, many lives. Now, she, sitting watching the television, didn't think to herself, I'm only one person. That's a whole country. What can I do to make a difference? She said, no, I can make a difference. And she got in touch with all the other Jews she knew who had the expertise and created this village and made this difference in their lives. And since she died this year, I'm telling you this story in her memory. Children, Hashem wants you to go out and bring blessings to the world. You're terrific young people at a terrific school. You've got lots of really difficult questions for me, I know. I wasn't allowed to see the questions in advance, so I'm going to be surprised by them. But thank you, and listen to the message. All you need to do is change one life for the better, and you begin to change the universe. Thank you very much indeed.